Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Great to have you all here today. Hope you're doing well. Today is the 8th of December, 2024. Wrapping up the year. Not today, but getting close. Let's go to our agenda here and we'll take a look at what we've got on the agenda for today. First of all, workshop, of course, it goes along with our courses over at school.learnlightandsound.com. And then, of course, we're delighted to have everybody join the live streams like today's. Today, we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We were working on some dialogue audio, and we were in DaVinci Resolve. It was a little bit of a stump the chump kind of scenario where Curtis is not super Fairlight savvy, enough to get the basics done, but we're going to pick up from where we left off last time. Also, there's a new version that came out since last week, 19.1.1. So hopefully that addressed some of the issues that we ran into. And we did have a question that was submitted ahead of time, which I would actually like to address right now. So let's go ahead and hop into that because it relates to what we're going to, well, it's just worth covering this quickly here. Just one question that was submitted. This is from Andrew. And Andrew says, I'm having trouble combining two tracks with different noise floors into a single track, or I assume mix, for a two-person interview scenario. I've had trouble in the past using two different mics with different gain levels on the same recorder, and also when using two different style body pack recorders with different lavalier mics. I try to match the noise floor by denoising one track before I begin processing, but after compression, etc., my noise floors can again vary. Well, what you're finding, Andrew, is perfectly normal. We all run into this at some point when, especially we're doing two or more people interviews or discussions or roundtables or whatever. This is pretty typical. So let me address what some of the things that I would do in post-production and also talk a little bit about some things you can do in production itself. When you're using boom microphones in particular, and they're facing different directions, so one is on me, this facing this way, and then we have another one on Danny, maybe facing a different direction, the room tone that each of those mics is going to pick up is going to be a little bit different. And that has to do, at least in cases, whistling, in cases where you have air conditioning or HVAC, a register blowing air into the room. If one of the mics is more on axis with that than the other mic, you are going to pick up a very different room tone signature from one of the mics versus the other. So this is a pretty typical thing. In production, one thing you can do is listen for that stuff ahead of time and try and reorient the microphones if you can to try and get their noise floors to sound pretty similar. That's one thing you can do. And another thing you can do in post-production is, I like the idea of denoising one of them. But this is like the classic case of where room tone is, like a separate room tone recording will help you make them sound similar. So ideally, because we're all smart, we record room tone when we're doing the production work. And then post-production, that room tone becomes really critical for helping make smooth transitions from when one person is talking to when the other person is talking in particular, or just matching the room tone from one microphone to the other. So as you make that cut, and you may be asking yourself, Curtis, are you suggesting that we add noise to our mix? And the answer is yes, I actually am. There are cases where that's your best bet. Not every recording is going to sound like it was recorded in a multi-million-dollar studio, and that's okay. What we're trying to do typically is make a seamless experience for the audience so they're not pulled out of the story by, whoa, what just happened on that audio cut? Like it's really jarring. So that's where I would add room tone to the mic. I would take room tone from the mic that you feel like where the room tone is a little louder. And I would add that at least as a transition as you make the cut. And I assume, Andrew, that you're also doing some sort of railroading. In other words, when one person's talking, you have their microphone in the timeline, but you have the other person who's not talking. You've cut out that portion of their dialogue because they're not talking. So that's just a bunch of room noise. So you cut that part out, and of course you crossfade as the other person starts talking. You crossfade into the other person. Then I would have another track with the room tone and slot that in so that you get a smooth transition from one person talking to the other person talking. We covered that a little bit in our Fairlight course. I don't think we used room tone necessarily, but that's the general idea, and we could demonstrate that at some point on a future episode. But it's a great question. It's something we all run into at some point. A lot of people don't realize this, but recording two people at the same time, each with their own microphone, is far more complex than recording a single person and then mixing that in post. And so this is normal. All I just want to say that is it's normal to struggle with this and to experience, especially the first time experiencing it or running into it time and time again. Those are some of the things that I would recommend. Okay, let's pick up where we left off. So we're going to head back over to DaVinci Resolve, and we're going to be working in Fairlight again. Last week, as you'll recall, we'll go ahead and switch over to the Mac here. Just had the single dialogue track, so we're keeping things simple here to illustrate some things. Where we left off, if I right-click here and I analyze the audio levels, we had things sitting at minus 26. We want to get up to minus 23. You'll remember we set our target over here in the project settings. And we go to Fairlight. We set our target loudness to minus 23 LUFS. So that's what we're aiming for. That means this meter over here, this loudness meter, is going to help us identify that. So it shows a few things. Here at the top, it shows the true peak level. So as we play back this audio, we can go ahead and reset it and start it. As we play back this audio, it's going to tell us where our peaks are topping out, where they are. And we're using true peak, which is a little bit different than peak. True peak actually accounts for the reality that in digital audio, we have samples. And in fact, if I zoom way in here, let's go right there. Let's zoom way in. Oh, see those little dots? Those are samples, individual samples. And in our recording here, we have 48,000 samples per second. So what that means is that when you have a peak, let's see if we can find a spot. I'm going to zoom back out a bit here. And let's find a peak. Right here is pretty close. Zoom in some, and we will get even closer to... Oops, playing back a little bit. Sorry about that. There's a peak. Zoom in. You can't see it here, but when you have some transients, sometimes there will be two different samples next to each other. And once that audio gets converted back from digital to analog for playback, for when you're listening in your headphones or on speakers, it is actually technically possible for the actual waveform to go higher than either of those two samples. That's possible. It happens in some cases. In this case, it doesn't seem to happen, but there are cases where that can happen. And that's what true peak is measuring. It's taking into account that those transients, things can get a little funny during those transients. And let's just take a look here at another one here and see if we can find one. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. Nope, that one still is also looking pretty managed there. But that's the idea with true peak. And the reason true peak is important is that when you go from a format like WAVE, which is what this audio was recorded in, which is a lossless format, into a lossy format, things can get a little bit funny. And there are reasons for that. As you're compressing the audio in terms of making the overall file smaller, I'm not talking about audio compression here, but making the file smaller, one of the things that happens is those lossy formats will eat up the headroom that you have here. So if I have a true peak that goes, if I have a sample peak that goes to -4, and that's my max sample peak throughout the entire piece of audio, it actually may take away that 4 dB of headroom. It may just steal it and say, hey, we're not even going to represent that here. That's a great way for us to save space in this audio file. So they'll essentially eat up, and I'm using air quotes here, eat up that headroom and use it to compress the file instead. So that's a really kind of rough and tumble way to describe it, not very technically accurate. There's a lot more involved, but that's one thing to keep in mind. So with the reason I'm kind of going on about all this is that True Peak, when you're mastering your audio, you want to make sure that you keep the True Peak level to at least minus 1.5, preferably minus 2 on your finished audio, so that when it then goes and you encode it, when you go to export your final video or audio, that it won't clip. If you go above that minus 1.5 or so, it's possible for it to still clip. So that's why True Peak is the measure that most are using today for it, certainly in the broadcast world, but also all of us should be using it as well. All right, then we have our loudness meter here. And the way this particular loudness meter works is that 0 is your target. In our case, that's minus 23. So it's a relative meter here. And you'll notice here as we play back, let me just go ahead and play back a little section here. And let's just see where we're at. Over mics, I use the Rode NT1 4th generation every single day at work for Zoom calls, but also when I'm recording voiceovers for videos that we're producing at work. NT1 is my go-to. I've used some others as well. I've used the Rode NTR a little bit recently, which is kind of an exotic microphone, I would say. It's a ribbon microphone, but the one that I keep coming back to. Okay, so you can see right now we're about 4 LUFS, 4 loudness units from our target of minus 23. So we definitely need to boost these overall levels. So we'll come back to that. That's the last thing we do. And the reason I want to, there are some other things I want to cover first as well. So to achieve that, we may have to do some other things. We may need to do a little bit of compression so that we can pull these peaks down, because right now you can see our true peak and that section we played is at minus 7.5. But I'm going to bet you if we play over here, notice this transient right here. Let me play this section. Kind of the longevity of those things. So that calls into question again, why? Why are you doing this YouTube stuff? Honestly, I'm a little tired of gear. I have what I need. I've got... Okay, notice it jumped up to minus 5.7. So we do have some headroom to work with. And we may actually just be able to boost it up. Let's just try here and see what happens. Well, we'll come back to that. And there's a reason I want to do that. Jumping ahead. Let's cool it off, cool the engines. Let's find out what else do we need to do with this audio. So remember from last week, we added the debreather and we talked about kind of the pros and cons of that. I would say the debreath, this is from RX. It's called the RX debreather. I would say that this is I would only rely on this for kind of quick and dirty work. If I'm going to do a really special mix, I'm actually going to go in manually. And for example, here, if we zoom in, we can probably find a few breaths here and there as well. Let's go find some. Now for work, I have a Universal Audio Apollo Solo, and it's nice because I can have a compressor running in real time on the audio interface. So that's really good for the Zoom calls and when I'm doing voiceover and things like that. So here's one here. I do use an A10. Okay, so if I use this tool right here, which is called focus mode, and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more, I can come in here. I can highlight that breath in between the phrases here. Just clean it up. There we go. And I can actually, here we go. I can pull that down. So I'm going to pull it down. Let's try like 8 dB. Let's play it again. Audio gear. I do use an A10 Mini Extreme. From Audio Gear, I do use an A10 Mini. Okay, and then back up where it was. From Audio Gear, I do use an A10 Mini. So that's a good example of how, whoops, let's go grab that again. Bring it down like that. I don't like cutting out the breaths. I think it makes it start to sound robotic and unnatural and like an AI is talking. I like to leave the breaths in there, but I like to attenuate them so that they're not so distracting. And some people have more of an issue with that than others. In my case, there's quite a bit of that. From Audio Gear, I do use an A10 Mini Extreme. I have the Sorry about that. Still talking. So that's an example of how I would do. So I'd run through the entire dialogue track and grab all the breaths like that. So that's one thing I would do. Now, do we have a noise problem? Let's see if they fixed in this brand new version here. Let's see if they fixed the issue that we were having before. If we go to the external audio process and go to Isotope RX. Okay, here's our audio here. We're going to see if when we bring this back, if it's still having the problem that it was having before. We're not too noisy, I wouldn't think. I think we're in a pretty good spot, actually. So I wouldn't really do any denoising here. I would first probably start with voice denoise if I did need to do some denoising. That one's pretty simple. So in Isotope RX, I go to adaptive mode, dialogue, gentle, and run it through that. And I don't do more than about around 3 dB of reduction at any given time. You might do multiple passes, but I find that if you do smaller passes each time, it does a better job in the end. So that's a pretty simple way to do that, but I don't think this track actually needs that, so I'm not going to bother with that here. If I had any plosives, I would come in here and use a deplosive. Remember we applied a high pass filter, so that would help a lot as well with taking a lot of the plosive out. Extreme plosives may need some additional work. Keep in mind that the deplosive module here, if you use it, the trick is that it's essentially pulling out some of the low frequency content. So you might want to, it's not a kind of thing that you would apply to your entire track. You would highlight just a section where you want to do the deplosive and just apply it there. And a lot of these, actually, that's the case for a lot of these. Declick, I would never apply declick to the entire track, because what'll happen is that your words that start with consonants, hard consonants, fricatives, you're gonna start to affect those, and it's gonna start to sound like somebody has a lisp or is less articulate in their speech. So I would just, again, highlight the section that you want to declick and use this. Another thing I do too is that sometimes if I come back out to this view here, here's a breath, and I have this tendency to do this thing. Let me just play it for you. It's kind of annoying. Let's just make sure that we have this set up right so that you can hear it. Okay. So we'll kind of loop through this a few times. Hear that? What I'm doing at the start of the breath, I'm doing a kind of a pa, pa, pa. Okay, so what I would do in this case is we actually have this instant process, which is pretty nice. And you can do a couple of different things. You can highlight something and immediately RX will either replace it, attenuate it, declick it, fade it, change the gain on it, or replace it. And replace, basically what it's doing is it's reading around it and kind of interpolating and creating a new version. So if I highlight just this portion right here where I have that, it'll do this. And this is what it sounds like now. Just highlight that again. And here we go. Sounds more like a regular breath. So a lot of times when I have a click nowadays, I'm going in and manually doing them. I'll either use the replace or the declick. I actually find the replace does really, really well in between words. If you're doing it in a word, you have to be a lot more careful certainly with replace, but even with declick can be a little bit tricky within words, but that helps a lot. So those are some other things I would do. Let's see here. If you have the advanced version, there is this ambiance match, and this can be really helpful, Andrew, for the question you were asking earlier about mismatched room tones. You could actually learn the ambiance from one track and apply it to the other track. So if you wanted to, that's another way you could achieve the same thing. I would probably just stay in Fairlight and apply another track with room tone to match underneath the track where the dialogue is not having as much room tone and sounded very abrupt when you cut to it. So I would also make sure that you're using crossfades and fades on the room tone and on the dialogue track so that you don't get anything jarring. So I think you're probably already doing some of that. All right, so that's kind of an overview of what I would do here. Let's go ahead and save this and see if it brings it back okay. So if I just save, head back over to Resolve, there we go. And if we bring up the media pool, looks like it brought it in. Yeah, looks, I think we got it. Maybe they fixed that in the .1.1 release. So if not, what I could always do is, again, come to Show Audio Track Layers, and I can move things around here if I need to. So if I wanted to bring this layer, if this was the one I wanted, I could pop this one up. You could see this is the one. It actually was right. I'm going to go ahead and undo. This was the one we were working on before, and this is the one that came back from RX. So we did have the right one. So it did. It looks like they did fix that issue. Thank you, Blackmagic Design. Thank you very much for staying on top of these things. Brilliant. So that is the audio track layer view. We'll just go back to our normal view here. Okay, let's kind of jump ahead here. So let's say we got everything cleaned up on this track. We have our music, you know, if we have intro music at the start, for example, we have that cut in on another track. We have, if there are multiple dialogue tracks, we have both of those in here as well. And we've done all our railroading, we've done our crossfading, we've cut in room tone if we needed that. We've got it sounding pretty good. We're pretty happy with the way it sounds. Now, one thing too, Andrew, is that I think a mistake, just back to Andrew's question really quickly here, is if it seems like noise is becoming more prominent at the end, that's because you're probably applying that quite a bit of compression and makeup gain after the fact. So whenever you compress, if we go back to the main camera for just a second here, when you compress, what you're doing is you're taking the peaks and you're pulling those down, but everything else is remaining the same. And then what you do is once you've managed those peaks, you brought them down some, then what we do is we normalize, or we use makeup gain, and we push everything up. And what that means is it means that this noise floor is also coming up and becoming more prominent. So that's something you have to definitely watch for. So when you're doing your original mix, when you're kind of cleaning up the dialogue tracks, you might want to, it's not a bad idea to manage that noise in those pretty early on and kind of get them matched in as much as possible so that you have those in the same place, roughly. And if you have to, this is where I would advocate turning up the volume just a little bit, just to check, and then back down to normal operating volumes, just to kind of see where that noise floor is. Also, if you're having to compress a lot, that means you have highly dynamic sound, highly dynamic dialogue, or whatever it is that you're working with. That's going to put you at a little bit more risk of raising that noise floor quite a bit, because you're going to have to do a fair bit of compression to get there. So those are some things to keep in mind. Now, we had 2 questions last week about, hey, I don't understand how to get my audio loud enough for YouTube or wherever I'm posting it. I have to crank my volume, the volume on my videos way up, whereas everyone else's videos seem already quite a bit louder. So how do we do that? So if I had an entire mix here, what I would do is I would come up to, let's see, I would bounce the entire mix to a single track. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm essentially baking everything together into a single, in our case, stereo track. So if I have one dialogue track for person 1, a dialogue track for person 2, a noise floor track to kind of help blend everything together, plus a music track for intro music, plus maybe a sound effects track if I had some sound effects, we're going to take all of that and all of those, what did I just list there, 6 or 7 tracks, and we're going to mix them down into a single stereo track. So that's what we'll do, is we'll bounce this to a new track, and it's asking us what we want to bounce from. So we're going to go ahead and put this on a new track. So we're going to take bus 1, that's our main stereo mix over here, and we're going to put it in stereo format, and we're going to bounce it to a new track. So here we go, boom. Now in our case, this is just essentially taking our mono dialogue and putting it on, oh, I wasn't showing the Mac. Let's go back to the Mac. Here, let me show you that again. I wasn't showing that to you, my mistake. So what we want to do is we're going to come up to timeline, bounce mix to track, It's going to take our stereo bus, that's our main output bus right here, and it's going to put it in, it's a stereo format, and we're going to tell it to bounce it to a new track, just like that. Click OK, and it's baking everything in. It's taking all those different tracks. In our case, it's only one, but in the example I kind of spoke to, it could be 7, it could be 100, it could be whatever, and you're putting it all together into a single stereo track. And once it's done with that, you can see it's going to take a little while. This one was about, I think, I don't remember how long this was, 20 minutes or something. This one's a pretty long one, so it's going to take a minute. And it's baking in our de-esser. I turned off the debreath because, again, I would only typically use that in cases where, like I'm just doing something quick and dirty. But the problem is it catches stuff that it shouldn't sometimes. Also, in the studio version, I should also mention while this is running, we have some time here. If you needed to do some voice isolation, this could be a useful tool here. I actually would think, I really think that DaVinci Resolve is a pretty amazing deal. For $300, you get a perpetual license, as far as I can tell. I bought mine in like 2016 or 17 and haven't had to buy another one since then. But in the studio version, you get this voice isolation, the dialogue leveler. Those can be really, really useful tools as well, especially if if you don't have a big investment in a lot of other plugins. But I want to show you some of these other plugins here that I would use for mastering and kind of making things sound a little smoother as well. Okay, so now it's taken our entire mix and put it down here onto audio track number 4. And I'm just going to rename this here. We're going to call this our mix for master. So that's our mix, and we're going to go ahead and mute all these others. 1, 2, and 3. So, and in fact, what I can do here is I can come over here to the index, and if I've muted these 1, 2, and 3, and I just want them out of my way, I can actually turn them off so that we just have a cleaner user interface to work with. Do a Command Z, or sorry, Shift Z to get it zoomed out to fill the timeline here. And there we go. There's our new mix. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. So again, there are lots of other things. We've covered noise reduction a bunch of times in the past. So if you're curious about how to do that, definitely go look up some of those other videos. But what I want to cover here is let's just see where we're at in terms of overall loudness. I can analyze our audio levels here, and we should be at minus 26. Okay, so we're definitely still at minus 26. All good there. And let's say we want to get to minus 23. So I'm going to reset and start my loudness meter over here. And I can just run through this. And as I'm doing that, I know, well, actually, what was our true peak? Did it tell us? Our true peak, well, we have enough room. We could just actually normalize and not have to do anything. So we could just right click, normalize the audio levels. I want to leave at least minus 1.5 dB true peak, and I want to target, let's get that to minus 23. We click normalize, and there we are. Let's just double check that. We're at minus 23 and minus 2.5 dB full scale on the dB true peak. So this is what it sounds like now. It sounds great, and it's not like some big microphone in front of my face. It's not distracting from what we're trying to talk about. It's a great mic. Now, audio interfaces. So when I am using an audio interface, a Motu M2 is really all I need. The reality is, of course, I have, for lots of reasons that we won't necessarily go into here, I do have a Universal Audio Apollo X6. That was bought for the... Okay, stopping there. So some of you might ask, wait a minute, Curtis, look, it's plus 1.2 on the integrated loudness. Yeah, we haven't played the whole thing yet. That's why. If you played this entire thing, that would get you, it would show you the same number that it shows us here. I click on the Analyze Audio Levels, whoops, and we would show minus 23. So this would show 0 right here on integrated, meaning that we're right on target at minus 23 LUFS. So, and then the dB true peak here would show at minus 2.5. Again, if we reset it, started playing back from the start, played it all the way through, this meter would show the same thing that this meter, or this Analyze Audio Levels is showing. So that's the idea there. Now, if I needed to do some additional compression, so for example, YouTube allows the max loudness of minus 14 LUFS. And if I had to guess, they chose that because a lot of other streaming services choose that as well. I believe Spotify is also minus 14. I think Apple is at minus 16 LUFS. And the thing is interesting about that is that Spotify is largely, at least certainly started as a music streaming service, and the same with Apple Music. I think YouTube chose that because it was also kind of basically a good place to put things for music. But if you have a mostly dialogue program, to me, minus 14 can be a little bit much. It makes it so that it's easier to listen to if you're on an airplane or in a subway or in a car. But it can also be a little fatiguing to listen to if you don't compress it and normalize it in a really useful way. Okay, time out.
Can you finish that thought and then take some questions?
Yeah, we're going to take some questions in just a second here. So let's demonstrate here in just a moment after we answer some questions how we could actually compress this and normalize it to a louder standard. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the chat here. We're at 1:30. Take a look and see what we have coming in here. Matt says, when I was recording in Africa, no treatment, no way to deal with external sound. I had 2-channel MKH 416s, then on a third mic, an Earthworks QTC50 on just the background noise. Okay, noise. Then I cut that room noise in and railroaded the interview, and it made the interview sound better with a noise that I could manage on the third track. Yes, that is a great example of, thank you, Matt. That's a great example of how you can post-process those, especially when you don't have a lot of control over the noise in the room or the sound or the tone of the room. During production, again, I would still advocate for, if you can often just turning the mic a few degrees can make a huge difference in what it's picking up. I'd be careful with a Sennheiser MKH 416 in those cases indoors, because as you turn it, the off-axis sound has a tendency to sound otherworldly. So it could be like if there's an HVAC register nearby, if you turn it off-axis, instead of being it could turn into a So just use your ears and turn the microphone so that it's in the best position. Micro adjustments can make a huge difference. But nevertheless, Matt, that's a great example of how to manage that in post-production as well, where you may have to cut in some noise to get the other microphone sounding like a different microphone on a different person within that same overall program. So great example of that. Thomas, do you have any time-saving tips for locating what areas need declicking? Does Find Similar do a good job when locating where to prioritize, or do you just accept that you're going to micromanage clicks? Again, it depends on I think it's helpful to decide up front, what are your production value goals? If good enough is good enough, you could just send it through. I would just turn on mouth declick from RX, run that over the entire audio clip, the whole program, and move on. And that may be good enough. If you're having, and there's a mouth click for you. But if you're doing a special mix, that's where I accept that, hey, this mix is going to take me longer. I'm committed to that. I've decided that's what I want to do, and that's where I'll go in and actually manage the individual clicks. So it's simple as that. You just have to decide what you want to do. I'm not saying that every single piece of audio must go through the magnifying glass and must be micromanaged. Now, Danny's telling me to move on because I'm going on and on about this same topic over and over again. Have you covered do's and don'ts of removing VA movement yet? What are you referring to as VA movement? I need a little more info on that. Apologies. Hey, Curtis, the round tripping with external editors was fixed with the last update. Hooray! We're back to normal again. That's great. Happy to hear it, and thank you for alerting us to that last week. very, very much appreciate that. Sounds like you may have alerted Blackmagic to that as well. Simon, how do you approach eliminating ground loop? Any advice on how to manage it while recording in studio, preferably, or in post-production? Well, there is the de-hum in post-production, but that's less than ideal. So I would definitely handle that in production in as much as possible. If you're setting up in your own space, figure out which circuits, which outlets are on which circuits. So if you have outlets in a single room that are on different circuits, then you're going to probably, depending on what you have connected here. So for, do the math and figure out how many watts you're drawing from all your equipment. You might be able to run everything from a single outlet and just use a box. I actually use Furman makes a, like a floor model where it has 6 outlets and you plug it into the wall. It's got a very thick, beefy cable that goes into the wall. It has some filtering built into it. So I would run everything as much as possible through a single outlet if you can do that. If you're also running lights, you may be bumping up against the circuit's capacity if you're on a breaker or on a fuse. So check to see at the breaker box how many amps you have to work with. Calculate. So if you're in the United States, 120 volts is what we typically run here, times the amperage of that particular circuit, which you can find either at your breaker box or your fuse box. Multiply those together. That tells you how many total watts you can run. And then figure out with all the equipment that you're setting up. Or you may not even need to convert to watts. You just add up the current specs for each piece of gear that you're connecting to that outlet, and that'll get you in the right spot. Now, if you're just running audio gear, you're probably going to be able to run it on most 5 amp circuits, household circuits, so unless you're running something really, really heavy duty. That's how I would fix it in production. Okay, Thomas. Bouncing 2 mono tracks into 1 stereo track, how would you pan the 2 tracks before bouncing if you have a left and right person in the frame? I would not pan. I don't do that. I don't typically make interviews. I don't try to make them immersive. I actually find that kind of annoying. Because you need to have a separate immersive export and just a regular export for everyone that's listening on stereo or mono. I just don't find that in all of the immersive film post-production people that I've heard from, they pretty much say the only time we ever have any spoken or vocal material that's not in the center speaker is maybe if you have something that's like in the middle of a battle scene and you may have some person on screen that runs by. You might have their, whatever they're muttering as they run by or yelling as they run by, you might put that into one of the surround speakers or make it an object within your Atmos mix. But regular dialogue always goes, pretty much everyone I've ever heard said, yeah, we've experimented with putting dialogue as an object and moving it around, but what we found is it's best just to put that in the center speaker. It always translates better. So that's my advice. Okay.
We have a clarification on this question. Okay, so here it is.
Okay, so the clarification is when they shift in a chair, rub an arm, or things like that. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. You may or may not have the opportunity to do a lot with that, but you could do some spectral denoise if you wanted to get in and really clean that up. If I'm doing the production and it's something really bad, like I've had people sitting on leather couches or faux leather couches and it sounds like flatulence when they move, I'm like, hey, we need to do a retake. Let's just recapture that one altogether. That's one thing you can do, but in post, then you're talking about spectral denoising is essentially it. That's beyond the scope of what we can cover here. That's a topic in and of itself, probably a couple of weeks, a couple of 2-hour sessions to cover that. But yeah, I'd probably get out the spectral denoiser and start getting in there and see what I could do. That's pretty intricate work as well, as you well know, I'm sure. Okay, do you use BS 1770-1 or 4? Does it matter much? So 4 is the latest version, as I understand. Maybe there's a 5 at this point. Actually, if we go back to the Mac, let's take a look and see what this supports here if we come in here and we analyze our audio levels, yeah, I believe 4 at least is the latest that is supported by Blackmagic Design. So it's just the latest standard. They've made some minor tweaks to it. You should just use the latest one if you can. If you can't, you're going to get really, really close with the other one. I think they've been doing some things in terms of tweaking where gating occurs. So the thing is when you're measuring loudness, one of the things that they do, because there are all these questions, these practical questions that come up. In the olden days, we would look at dB RMS, which means decibels root mean square, which is basically an average. So you would take the entire audio mix and you would just get the average dB level using what a root mean square averaging algorithm. The problem with that is, if you think of it in the context of music, or actually let's not think about it in the context of music, let's think about it in the context of dialogue. What if there is a very emotional interview and there's a period of 5 or 10 seconds where people are not saying anything? That pulls the average down a lot. When you go measure that, that's going to pull the average down a lot. And so it really skews the measure. So you could have 2 different audio clips of 2 different programs that came out to the same dB RMS level, but they actually sounded very different in terms of loudness. So that's what the LUFS and the LKFS measurement algorithms do, is they're much more careful about that. So if the level falls below a certain level, it actually cuts that out. It gates it out and doesn't count it towards the overall loudness units full scale, or the loudness units relative to K-weighted full scale. It doesn't count those as in part of the overall measurements. So it does get closer to how humans perceive loudness. So there's a lot of stuff involved there, and the papers are actually available online. If you really want to go nerd out and go take a look at those, you can see what those do, and you can actually see what the updates to version 4 does. But yes, normally, short answer, use version 4 if you can. Fachiri. That was a long answer I should have just said yes, use 4. But I want to give you the context. So just a question, how do you isolate a mic like an SM5758 on a podium? Every time the speaker touches the podium, there's some noise. It has a lot to do with the mount. So depending on if you're using a gooseneck, a lot of times the goosenecks will have a rubberized gasket at the bottom where it attaches to provide some isolation. So if you're putting it up there on your own with your own microphone, what you might do is get some sort of thin foam layer or something where you can just do whatever you can to provide a little bit more isolation, so that when the people touch or hit the podium, if they're very animated, it doesn't create a lot of noise. You can also, if you have the opportunity, just let them know ahead of time, hey, what we're finding is if you tap the podium, it's going to make a lot of noise for the audience. So try not to do a lot of fiddling on the podium itself if you're having that problem. That would be like oh my gosh, I don't have time to solve this problem. Let me just talk to the person who's going to speak, just so they're aware. That's a lot. By the way, that's a lot to put on the speaker. Ideally, you should have this problem solved ahead of time, so they don't even have to think about it, because they have got a lot of other things to think about in presenting. So, all right, Linda, who has experience with plant mics? I have a little bit of experience with plant mics. Plant mics are, for those that are not familiar with the term, plant mics are usually, instead of placing a lavalier microphone on a person or booming a microphone above the person that's talking, in production terms, a plant mic is you hide a microphone somewhere within the set so that when the talent comes over and is in that area, that microphone will pick them up. That's a plant mic. Yeah, you can definitely use those. It depending on the, if it's a scripted piece, it's a lot easier to do something like that. But we've used it before. We were doing just a goofy little piece once at the office. We actually placed the plant mic behind a coffee cup in front of the main person who was talking. So, and believe it or not, we just used a Zoom H1. And then in post, we cut out one of the channels. So we had one of the microphones facing the person that was talking. And that worked really, really quite nicely as an example of a plant mic. All right, friendly reminder to return to your comments, train of thought about the audio interface you're using. Oh, that's not what we're talking about here. Sorry, that's the recorded audio. That is in another video on my main channel. You can go listen to the entire thing. It's which gear do I use for my YouTube videos. It was two weeks, last week? Yeah, it was last week actually. So that you can find out all the details there.
There are more questions, but do you want to go back to what you were doing?
Yeah, let's go back to what we're doing. We'll come back to some more questions in just a minute here. So if I needed to optimize this audio for, let's say, for example, I wanted to change my target here, come back into our project settings, and I want to target, let's say, minus 17 LUFS. And again, just as a reminder, right now, we're at minus 23. So I need to get 6 dB additional, or 6 loudness units more. And I also need to maintain my true peak headroom. That means I have to do some compression because these peaks are getting in the way. Now, if you have something, again, as we talked about last week, if you have transients that are sticking way out, I would first go manage those before we get to this point. Before we do this mix down that we've done, if I were actually to do an undo and an undo, and let's see if I come back to this. Yeah, just this track one. If I should really be coming in here. Whoops, that's not the one I wanted. I should really be coming in here, and we demonstrated some of this last week, but this spot like here, for example, this would be a great example of where I would actually take this entire thing here, and we would pull this down by 3 dB. Just to give yourself enough headroom, because this transient is just a little bit out of control. So drop it by 3 dB. It's not sticking out quite so much now. We also took care of this breath a little bit. We could come in and actually drop the breath even more if we wanted to. And just kind of highlight this right here. And reduce the breath even more. But I would do all that work ahead of time before we get to the final mix down, the mix for master. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to move this out just so that we're back here. Shift Z to get the full view. Okay, now this is where I'm probably going to bring in a compressor and we're going to do a little bit of compression work. So there are a variety of ways to do this, and I'm going to go ahead and close the media pool and the index, open up our effects. There are a million different compressors, and we could actually just even use the dynamics compressor right here. This is nice because it has both a compressor and a limiter, and you can do the makeup gain right here as well. So this is one way you could do it, and we've covered that in the past in some of our other videos, but in terms of the plugins that I usually reach for, there are a few. So first, what I would typically do is, let's pull up our effects here. And I'm going to go into my VST effects here. We have a bunch of fab filter. I do like the Fab Filter Pro C is really quite good. But I'm going to go ahead and pull Nectar out. Nectar is a pretty straightforward one. So I'm going to take Nectar. We're going to bring that over here into our A4 right here in the effects. Drop that in. I'm not sharing our experience. Sorry about that. We don't need an EQ, so I can go ahead and get rid of that. I can just remove that. I'm just going to use the compressor here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start playing through and adjust things. And the main thing I'm doing here is I'm going to probably, normally for dialogue, I'm going to be somewhere around a 3-to-1 ratio. That's how much compression you're doing, how much you're compressing those transients when they come above the threshold. I'm going to tweak the threshold as we go. My attack, because we're doing dialogue, I usually leave that at about 2 milliseconds because I want to let those fricatives through. I want to let those consonants at the starts of words through. I don't want them to be muffled. So I'm going to go ahead and let those through, and that's what 2 milliseconds does there. Here for my release, I usually end up around about 120-ish, somewhere in there. And the reason I do that is that if I go too long, the breaths tend to get really amplified because the compressor is still compressing during the breath. So try not to do that. And then I'm going to go ahead and leave automatic gain, makeup gain turned on. So we'll just leave that on. So let's go ahead and listen to this and see what happens here. So I'm going to go ahead and start running through. Here we go. So calls into question again. Why? Why are you doing this YouTube stuff? Honestly, I'm a little tired of gear. I have what I need. I've got piles of stuff around here. As a gear reviewer, we've got so many things that I can choose from to use when I make my YouTube videos here. So the question is, which do I actually use? When I had given a choice and I have all these options in front of me, which ones do I actually find myself going back to over and over and over again? And this is specifically for the YouTube video production. For my professional work, that's kind of a different story, although there's a... Okay, I'm going to pause there for just a second. I'm going to jump ahead to a spot where we have some transients that are sticking out. Maybe start right here. Rodecaster Pro 2. So those are the reasons why I use it. It sounds great. It has plenty of gain for any microphone you might ever use, including a Shure SM7B. So you wouldn't need a cloud lifter or FET or anything like that. All right, lighting. Okay, so it's still running by, you can see here though, but I'm not sure. We're probably going to need to bring that threshold down even more. And let's run through that section again, starting here. Right there. So those are the reasons why I use it. It sounds great. It has plenty of gain for any microphone you might ever use, including a Shure SM7B. So you wouldn't need a cloud lifter or FET or anything like that. All right, lighting. Aperture. Okay, so that's bringing it down by about 5 dB. So that's going to get us pretty close. So I'm going to go ahead and let's apply that. That's going to get us pretty close here. What I can do is I can actually do this. I can come in and actually bounce that to a new track, and I can put it as, let's see here. I thought there was a way to bounce into new layer. Here we go. So I'm just going to put this as a new layer. So here we go, bounce, and now it's a new layer. Now if I right click and I choose Analyze Audio Levels, let's see where we're at. Okay, we have a lot more headroom now, so we're getting closer. So again, remember, I'm going to boost this by about 6 dB. No, I'm going to have to boost it even more. It's at minus 26 right now. I'm going to have to boost it by 9, so we're going to need even more headroom than that. Somehow I was under the impression we were at minus 23 already. So in any case, that means I'm going to have to do some more compression here. So let's go ahead and pull this back up, and let's do another run through. Let's do this section right here to see how it's going. Now, there are a couple things I'm listening right now to make sure that as I compress these transients down, that it's not altering the character of the dialogue too much. I want it to be fairly transparent. I don't want it to be obviously compressed. So keep your ears kind of open for that. I think it was, and it's been working great. For audio, for live streams, as far as mixers, I use the Mackie DLZ and sometimes the Mackie DLZ XS, the smaller version. These are roughly competitors with the Rodecaster. Jumping ahead to here, anything like that. All right, lighting. Aperture 600C Pro is my key light, completely overkill for most YouTubers, and I use it. It's maybe a little heavier than I'd like, but let's do it and see where we get. Let's go ahead and bounce that to a new layer. Measure this layer, see where we're at. Did we get any more headroom? A little tiny bit. We may need to, we're going to need to go, let me undo. We're going to need to go a little bit harder here on this compression. Pull that back out and keep playing through. Here we go. Because I have it on over here with the big spotlight, not the original spotlight, but the big one. And it's bouncing off of unbleached canvas or unbleached muslin right here. And that's our key light here. I use it because I have it, because I reviewed it and Aperture sent it over to me. But if I were funding it myself, I'd probably be using an Amaran 200 XS. And that one has great color quality, really, enough output for talking head video. So to me, that would be a great one. Pairing that with the Light Dome SE, and I think most YouTubers are going to have everything they need. for rim lighting, and that's this very subtle lighting over here. See that on the side of my face? That is literally just the Amaran PT 4C over here. And okay, pausing there, you'll notice I turned on the limiter as well, and I dropped it to minus 2.2 just to kind of manage things. So here we go. It produces this really beautiful, soft rim light. So that's what I use. What's interesting, yes, I know it has inbuilt batteries. I don't use it that way. I always have it plugged in. So, and I still would urge Amaran, please, next iteration, make it so those batteries are replaceable. Okay, cool. Next, the Amaran 150C with a spotlight, or the 300C, you could use either one, to make this color on the background. And I'm using, that's what's putting the blue on the wall. And then over here, the purple, where I have this kind of gradient that I create, that's made with a Light Panels Gemini 1x1. Okay, pausing there. Let's go ahead and bounce that. New layer. Here we go. Just right click, see where we're at. I think there's something funny going on. We're going to have to come back to this because there's something funny going on there where it doesn't seem like I'm getting the additional loudness that I would have expected there. We just baked in quite a lot of compression. In fact, it was getting to the point where it was pretty obvious in a few cases, especially for the start of a sentence. So we're going to do some troubleshooting here. Okay.
We have a lot of questions, so let's answer the questions that we have, and we're going to go over slightly.
Okay, we're going to answer questions now, and we may go over just a little bit. Here we go. First,
to answer all these questions. So
can you analyze stereo out with multiple tracks in Resolve, or need to bounce first as you just did? Can you analyze stereo out with multiple tracks in Resolve? Well, the loudness meter is actually measuring the mix bus, so that is stereo. So yes, you can. Speaking of post-production, have you used the TC Sidus Sync program? And I have not, no. I'm actually delighted to see that Deity has released a new Sidus Sync program, so very much like Tentacles Sync what is it called? Tentacle Sync Studio, I think they call it. Now we have Deity's TC Sidus Sync. Essentially what it allows you to do is if you have recorded timecode to an audio track on your camera and timecode to your audio clips, then you can drop them into this app. It will convert the camera's audio timecode to metadata timecode and sync them up. And then you can export an XML that you can bring into your audio editing or video editing app. Very nice. Haven't tried it yet. Hardware question. I bought since 40 years of old used PCs, the first time new PCs. It's Mac Mini M4, smallest configuration, but each with 10 gigabit Ethernet. Any one of you cluster Mac M4 minis? I bought 5 M4, which equals 5 times 16 gigabyte of shared RAM. Wow, that's a lot of computing power. I don't have one, but for those in the chat, if you want to talk about supercomputers at home, DaVinci Girl looks like she has us covered. At the moment, I solder their SSD RAM and do a 2 terabyte update to each mini. Wow, that's serious DIY-ing. Good work. Shoji, how often do you manually fix without the aid of repair software dialog? I always use software for everything that you ever heard of on YouTube. I've used software to do something, if nothing more than just to manually audio or loudness normalize. Depending on, actually, I guess in some cases when I'm doing a review of a microphone, I don't want to process. And so in those cases, I will intentionally just normalize to -23 and leave it at that. That's it. So it just depends on the piece. Usually I'll do something to sweeten it, at least something. Linda says, I was thinking about a Zoom H1. I'd need to pick up some atmospheric sounds on set. That is a perfect little option for that. Get you a stereo track if you want it. Isn't it better to ramp the volume up or down instead of doing a straight cut? I think I might have missed the context here from the Los Angeles director. Isn't it better to ramp the volume up or down instead of doing a straight cut? Probably need a little more context on that. Yeah, I think you probably mentioned that at some point earlier when we were doing something. So I just need a reminder of what we were doing. Okay, next one. Thanks a lot for the answer, Simon. You bet. If you use the focus mode, it actually does add a small ramp. You need to zoom in to see it. Oh, okay. I think that might be what you're talking about. Yeah, that wasn't actually a cut. That was a, we can zoom in here. Let's say, for example, we're right here. Come on, zoom into where the playhead is. There we go. Okay, so if I come in here and I highlight this, you can see it's actually doing a ramp there. Obviously, I don't want to do that right there, but that's the idea. Is it's not just a cut; it's an actual. There's a ramp there, and you can add additional points too if you want to automate it to make it even smoother. Are you aware with the use of Nectar you win headroom, but it also is destructive to your voice, not natural anymore? I am aware of that. That's the trick with loudness normalizing, especially to the aggressive loudness targets for the streaming services like -14 LUFS. Almost every voice sounds, to me, overcompressed and is fatiguing to listen to, and that's what I was referring to, DaVinci Girl. So yes, I completely agree, and I'm aware. Anytime you reduce dynamic range, it starts to sound less and less natural. Marcus here also says, in my humble opinion, -14 is way too loud. I mix content on my channel to around -18. And if I get hired to create content for another brand, I go with -16. The only time I hit -14 is when I'm hired to create shorts. I concur. I'm not a big fan of -14 for primarily spoken word. Sometimes using a clipper on the dialog bus can shave off 2 dB much cleaner than a limiter, and it's easier to push the levels up to -14. Yeah, that's another topic too. So Ozone has a clipper you can use. There are lots of other clippers as well. But the problem with a clipper that I find is you still can get distortion. You can achieve that without actually technically clipping at -0 or 0 dB, but it will start to. It's basically like it starts to sound distorted if you have to do a lot of it. So that can be a little tricky too. Okay, friends, we have a lot to cover. I have a lot to learn here. Obviously. I'm learning along with you in Resolve and Fairlight. This is a new one to me. Typically, when I'm typically mixing for my YouTube videos, I'm doing all this cleanup and all of this processing ahead of the edit in Isotope RX Audio Editor. And then when I'm doing a proper mix at work, a lot of times I'm using Adobe Audition. So I'm still learning all of this here. Thanks for coming along on the ride with me to learn this together. Get out there, make some great sound this week, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.